don't talk about authentic self and bringing your whole self to work, and we want you to be who you are and all these sorts of things. And then the moment that somebody starts to share something, we try and shut it down. Hey, g'day there, fellow humans. Mark LeBusque here for the In the Raw podcast. Yet not the Simply Practically Human podcast, the one I've been doing now for 6 or 7 years. I've just been taking a bit of advice lately and also changing the format slightly to what I've been calling on the Simply Practically Human podcast, Ask Mark Anything, and caught up with a couple of listeners and also one of my guests who's been on the podcast, and speaking to some other people. They said, look, why don't you just keep going with that format of where you ask people for some questions and without notice, you give the real and raw answers that you see to those questions. Hence, Sarah Norman came up with the idea of the In the Raw podcast. So here we go. So as I've been doing the last few weeks on the Simply Practically Human podcast, which is now retired, I've taken questions from people about workplace leadership, human-related topics, and I'll just do my very, very best with very, very little or no notice to tell you what my take is on these. So the first one today comes from Joanne, and I think this is a ripping question, and it's I know people have very, very different perspectives on this, so I'll share mine. But Joanne asked me about how much sharing, telling personal stuff about yourself is enough or is too much, because it can elicit some very, very different responses and reactions from people in the room. So let me give this one a go. For those who have worked with me, they will know that a lot of times when people come into the room, because some of their colleagues have been in the room, they will say something to me like, "You're the guy that's going to make us cry." And I'm like, well, I don't make anyone cry. It's usually someone sharing something about themselves or hearing somebody else share something that may elicit some emotional response from them. And then what I observe in the room is all sorts of responses and reactions to that, from people being absolutely inspired by the stories that they hear, and they'll comment on the courage and the vulnerability that somebody shows. And then I'll also have people terrified and in a position where they're saying, look, we really shouldn't allow this sort of thing. You shouldn't sort of bring that sort of stuff into the workplace. At times also, you might find that somebody is just having a moment in the room, as I call it, and they might be getting emotional and maybe starting to show or shed a few tears, and someone will say to me, hey, you need to go over there and, work with them and help them because they're showing emotion. And I'm like, no, let them be. Let them do their thing. Let them work through whatever it is and they'll be okay. And there seems to be this idea that if somebody starts to show some emotion, one of the ideas is let's get them out of the room as soon as we can. Now, I'm wondering if all of that idea of getting him out of the room is about protecting them or maybe protecting the other people in the room. So here's my take on this. How much is too much? How much is enough? I like to think about it, fellow humans, as getting into a swimming pool, like a metaphor of getting into a swimming pool. Now, I say there are 3 ways you can do that, one being safer than the next one, that's safer than the next one. And I think at times we tend to see human beings in the room either use the first one or the last one, and it can create some issues in the room. So the first one is dipping the toe in. This idea, if you're going to start to share some stories and some personal stuff, and I really suggest this early on, is perhaps we just dip the toe in. We feel the temperature of the water. We feel if it's a bit too uncomfortable. Now, what I mean by feeling the temperature of the water is perhaps you're looking around the room and you're just looking for signs when people are starting to share stuff. And it might just be when we start this that we only share a story that's not not going to be jumping in the deep end, which is I'm going to go out to that outer area now and say, I have been in the room at times where people, including myself, may have jumped in the deep end too early, and that can have an impact on the people in the room. Some people may not be ready for that. Some people, the story may be far too familiar for them and far too raw for them. So they have a response themselves that's quite emotional. So my suggestion is that we look at that middle one, and that's like I call it stepping in. And you think about when you step into some water, you don't know what the temperature is, but it's a bit cold. We tend to have an initial uncomfortable feeling. And then when we acclimatize or adapt, we step down to the next step and we feel a bit more of that discomfort. And then we do that again, and we end up getting into our waist, and we do what I call the penguin, which is sort of a little shaky shake thing. And then we sort of adapt again, and we keep working out. So what I sort of say here is think about it like how are you going to enter a swimming pool? If you're just starting out doing some of this work and you're creating that space, have the conversation with the group. This idea that we shouldn't bring how we're feeling to work and personal stories to work and a bit of vulnerability into work, I think it's bullshit. I think there's too much of the let's do this goes on. Like, we need to be more vulnerable. We've watched the Brené Brown video and let's all have a crack at it. But then when it happens in the room, what I've experienced at times is people absolutely shit themselves. And they're now starting to worry about what's the potential implication of someone sharing their feelings in the room. So why don't you think about this? Perhaps one of the implications is you start to understand people a bit more who you work with. You might actually start to be able to put two and two together to go, oh, now I understand why when Mark shared that story, why he's feeling a certain way. And I just thought he was a bit off and he was having a bit of a hard time, but I didn't go and ask him because it sort of wasn't my place to do that. Well, here's the thing, folks. Once Mark shares his story, you can't unhear it. And whilst it may shock you in the moment, I think you need to be able to step into your leadership and understand that perhaps there was something you could have done when you were observing some of his behaviours that could have made things a whole lot better for you. One of the things I'm going to say that we shouldn't do is let's not try and rescue people from their catastrophe. And I see this happen quite a bit in rooms where someone will start to show a few emotions, maybe a tear or two, usually with an apology before they're about to do it, which I really don't understand why human beings do that. I think showing some emotion in the workplace is okay, as long as we're not jumping straight into the deep end. Or we're not doing it in a tokenistic way and dipping our pinky toe in and hoping that people think that we're going to win the vulnerability award for the week. So I think it's really important that we allow people to sit with it, sit with the discomfort. If they're showing some emotion, if they're sharing a bit of a story that will help us to understand them, don't think you've got to go and grab them and take them out of the room and let them calm down and then they can come back in, because that's what we're doing there, folks, is we are just creating robots, emotionless robots. Let's get that emotion out of the room. This is the workplace. We don't have emotion in the workplace. And ask yourself this question: are you really looking to rescue them or save them? Or has it got a lot more to do with either yourself or perhaps some unfounded assumptions you're making about how others in the room will be able to process and deal with that emotion and those stories that are being told? So I think regulation of it, I think having some conversations around the stories that you hear in the room can be really useful, because that helps us to process and it helps us to get to the point where I think we can become more comfortably uncomfortable with some deeper stories that come out. If someone happens to overshare, as people call it, well, that can happen at times. But I think it's really about just accepting that's happened, having a conversation as a group, and perhaps thinking again about why is it that we are both applauding some vulnerability these days as a leadership trait, but in some instances trying to avoid it by taking those people who are showing that vulnerability and telling those stories and showing some emotion and sharing some personal things out of the room so they can compose themselves and come back in. So, Joanne, I'm not sure that there's 100% answer to this one, but one thing to be really conscious of for all of you is if you are encouraging some storytelling and encouraging people to bring themselves to work, and I'd say perhaps you want to try and set some boundaries around that so that people can work their way into it, a bit like getting into that swimming pool and testing the temperature. But don't do it as a tokenistic thing. Don't talk about authentic self and bringing your whole self to work and we want you to be who you are and all these sorts of things. And then the moment that somebody starts to share something, we try and shut it down. And I guess the last thing here is if you're a rescuer, and I know there'll be some rescuers listening to this, stop trying to rescue people. Let people sit in their catastrophe for a period of time because that's where growth happens. That's where learning happens. That's where experimentation happens. That's where understanding can happen. But at the same time, be supportive. And one of the ways you do that is you listen. You be empathetic. You don't practice sympathy. And what I say you will see happen, because I've seen it in my own experience, is over time, rather than people jumping into the deep end of the pool, that the deep end won't feel so deep after a while. So thanks for the question, Joanne, and good luck in those moments when we've encouraged people to share some things and they do that, and then we're just going to see what happens from there. So there you go. There's the first one today from Joanne. Second question, how much of myself should I bring to work? Now that question has been posed to me by Adrian. So how much of myself should I bring to work? Now that's a very open-ended question. So my first thought to that is bring your whole self to work, as in physically bring your whole self, because trying to do it in some other way is actually not going to work. My sense around the question is perhaps around this idea of what should I hide? What sort of thickness of armor should I be wearing as I come through those doors? And the other thing will be, what do you think that people will expect of me and how I should show up? So my view on this one, again, a little bit like the first one, is don't spook the horses. So don't come in and be totally different to how you've been, would be my first suggestion here, Adrian. Have a think about the different roles that you play in the organisation, in your team, with your manager, with your peers, with your customers, whoever else it might be, and be thinking about how do I show up in each of those roles and how close am I to being who I really am? Because one of the things I've seen with this is that people move wildly away from who they really are depending upon the environment they find themselves in. And all of a sudden, the people that are closest to them start to wonder who the bloody hell it is that's turning up. And I can give you some examples of this. In my times as what I call bad mark, one day I'd walk into the office and I'd walk around and I'd say hello to everyone. The next day I'd walk into the office and I'd just shut my door. And two very, very different and distinct versions of me turning up. Now, there might have been some reasons behind that, but they're only bloody excuses, not really reasons and justifications. But if I look through the eyes of others, that's going to fundamentally change the way that they respond or react to me on a given day. So the first thing I'm going to say here, Adrian, is there needs to be some consistency in how you turn up. You might be having you might have had a bit of a shit morning before you got into work, or you might have had a shit meeting that you went to, or something like that. But that shouldn't swing you wildly from one end to the other, because what you're going to start to find happening, as I did, is that people don't come to you after a while. If they can't work out which version's turning up, particularly if it's the shitty version, you're going to find that they're going to run from you rather than run towards you. So the best piece of advice I can offer here, and I call it a combination of what I call humanovation, which is how you choose to be at any particular moment when you're engaging with another human being. This idea of what I call creating a to-be list, and how you can, in a moment, check yourself before you go into that next engagement, whether it's with a team or an individual or whatever it might be, could be your family. And the second part to that is what I call practicing the 2 A's. And an example of that would be, you go to back-to-back meetings, you've just been to a meeting that was pretty tense, things didn't go exactly how you wanted them to go, and you're feeling a bit shitty with that. So you've also got another meeting to go to, and you need to, in that moment, practice the 2 A's, awareness. So first of all, how am I feeling? What am I thinking? What am I carrying? What baggage do I carry from that last meeting? And whether or not, the big question, is it going to be helpful or harmful to be carrying those thoughts and feelings into the next engagement with another human being? If it's yes, well, I say go ahead. But if it's no, and it won't be helpful, but it will be harmful, I think you've got to practice that second A, which is adjustment. And in that moment, adjust. So ask yourself the question, am I going to turn up to that next meeting in a version of me that's going to be helpful or harmful? Now, this can be really hard to do because we're an emotional creature, and very, very easy to say, well, just park that at the door and don't take it through. But guess what? If you don't, and you think you can mask your way through it and that people won't pick it up, you're kidding yourself, because people absolutely pick it up. I've had this conversation quite regularly recently in the room with my clients and asking people about this, and I think there's a bit of denial. No, they won't know. They won't be able to pick up that I'm doing it. And when we have some open conversations, it's very, very evident in the room that people say, oh, no, I see that, Mark. I see it. When you have got the shits on, you become pretty withdrawn and pretty quiet. Now, we might say to you, are you okay? And you're like, yep, I'm good. As we say, the standard, yeah, I'm good. But the words aren't matching the body language or the facial expressions that we're seeing. So this whole idea of how much of myself should I bring to work, I think you bring your whole self to work, and you're going to know as a human being at different times of the day, different emotions are going to be triggered. You might be joyous. It might be a little bit, yeah, whatever. Or you might be frustrated. You might be angry, whatever it might be. You need to be able to, in that moment, regulate that version of yourself. Because if you don't, as I said before, it will impact significantly on those relationships. So there you go, just a couple for today to open up this new approach to my podcast, the In the Raw podcast. I hope that was raw and real enough for you. I hope you find it useful in some ways to help you to reflect on where you're at with this. But again, I always say, I think it'd be even better if you have these conversations within your organization, not always just about the work issues, but think about what are the human dynamics that are playing out. And these are the sorts of questions that you need to be talking about and answering and exploring in order to make what we call the important work, which is the technical stuff, work really well. So if you love this one, why not rate it 5 stars? It's the new In the Raw podcast. If you liked it, share it with your friends. share it with your colleagues, and I hope that it starts to create some conversations with you. But until next time, it's Mark LeBusque with the In the Raw podcast. We'll catch you next time.